He impaled his enemies. He tortured thousands. He murdered his own son with a scepter. That was Ivan the Terrible, a name whispered in fear, soaked in blood. A Tsar who reveled in cruelty, whose reign was a symphony of screams. You think you know evil. You think you've seen monsters. But what if I told you? This monster was once a child. A tiny, innocent boy named Ivan who cried for his mother and dreamed of playtime. What if I told you the true horror wasn't his evil, but what made him evil? This isn't just a history lesson. This is a terrifying autopsy of a soul, ripped apart by power and unimaginable trauma. It's the story of a crown that didn't just rule a kingdom, it devoured a childhood. And trust me, after this, you'll never look at innocence or power the same way again. Trust me, you've never heard a story like this before. You'll never look at a crown the same way again. Imagine, if you will, a world utterly unlike our own. Not some sanitized fairy tale land, no. This was 16th century Russia, a vast, brutal and deeply religious land, constantly teetering on the edge of chaos. Forget your Netflix historical dramas. This was raw, visceral power at its most unforgiving. At its heart was the Tsar, the absolute ruler, supposedly chosen by God himself. But beneath that divine facade, the court was a swirling viper's nest of ambition, betrayal, and unspeakable cruelty. Think less Game of Thrones strategy, more Lord of the Flies with crowns and daggers. Our hero in this twisted tale, a boy named Ivan, just 3 years old when his father, Vasily III, the Grand Prince of Moscow, unexpectedly died. 3, picture that. A tiny, vulnerable kid, still needing his mother's hand, suddenly thrust onto a throne forged from centuries of blood and ambition. He was the rightful heir, they said. He was the future. But what did future even mean for a child who couldn't even tie his own shoes, yet held the fate of millions in his unformed hands? This wasn't a world that nurtured innocence. Oh no, this society, it was a machine. A grinding, brutal contraption where bloodline was everything and vulnerability was a death sentence. The powerful boyars, the ruthless nobles who ran the show behind the scenes, they didn't see a child. They saw a puppet, a tool, a prize to be fought over, manipulated, and ultimately devoured. They clung to power tighter than a leech on a vein, and little Ivan was just another piece on their chessboard. This world wasn't designed to raise a healthy monarch. It was designed to break anyone who dared to stand in its way, even a king. Especially a child king. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many times do we, even today, in our seemingly enlightened world, put impossible burdens on the shoulders of the young? In the cutthroat world of child stars, the relentless pressure of elite sports, or even just in hyper-competitive schools, we see echoes of this. The expectation that a child, or anyone really, should simply cope with overwhelming circumstances or face catastrophic consequences. This story is a chilling reminder that some things, some pressures, are simply too much for any human, especially a developing one. And it was into this brutal, unforgiving world that the young Tsar Ivan was plunged, headfirst, into a nightmare that would forever define him. And this wasn't just neglect or even abuse. This was active, calculated psychological warfare waged on a child. The day his father, Vasily III, died, that was the day Ivan's childhood didn't just end, it was violently ripped away. He was three years old. Think about that. A tiny, vulnerable kid, still needing his mother's hand, suddenly thrust onto a throne forged from centuries of blood and ambition. He wasn't just a boy. He was the Grand Prince of Moscow, the future Tsar, and a prize. And the ravenous boyars, the ruthless noble families who were supposed to be his guardians, they saw his tiny crown as nothing more than a trophy to be seized, a puppet to be controlled. The struggle for regency, for ultimate control over the child Tsar, was brutal. It was ruthless, and it played out right before his innocent eyes. Can you even imagine? This little boy, probably still figuring out how to string words together, was forced to witness horrors that would break a grown man. He saw boyars, ostensibly his guardians, literally fighting, clawing, and murdering each other for power right inside the Kremlin's opulent halls. His closest advisors, the very people sworn to protect him, were often the most dangerous. They dragged bodies from his chambers. They poisoned rivals. He'd hide under tables, cowering, listening to the screams and the whispers of death. This wasn't some distant war. This was his. Home, his family. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, tried to shield him, to consolidate power, but even she couldn't last. She was likely poisoned when Ivan was just 8 years old. Think about that void. The one person who offered a semblance of comfort snatched away. And the whispers, the chilling realization that even she wasn't safe from the wolves circling the throne. The boyars literally starved him and his sister at times, depriving him of basic necessities. Imagine the psychological scars from that alone. This wasn't a stable environment. It was a constant, gnawing terror. I had no choice. He would later whisper this in the darkest corners of his mind, staring at a reflection he barely recognized. I didn't know who I was, but they knew. Exactly what I would become. A king, a puppet, a tragedy waiting to happen. The helplessness, the constant threat, the betrayals, it all carved deep, irreversible wounds into his young psyche. This wasn't just neglect. It was a systematic dismantling of a child's trust and sense of security. Every single act of violence he witnessed, every whisper of deceit, every moment he was left to fend for himself in that gilded cage, chipped away at his humanity, replacing it with fear and a desperate need for control. And as these years of terror blurred into a distorted adolescence, the true training for the future Tsar began. A chilling process designed not to build him up, but to strip him bare of everything that made him human. You might think it couldn't get any worse for little Ivan, but this wasn't just survival. It was a horrifying metamorphosis, a systematic stripping away of every human layer. The training began. Oh, sweet mercy, the training. They ripped away his innocence, not with grand gestures, but with insidious daily torture. His body, no more childish romps, no more carefree games. It was forced into stiff, heavy silks, taught to sit rigid for hours, to parade like a statue in endless, suffocating ceremonies. Every gesture, every breath, meticulously choreographed by the very boyars who tormented him. Walk like a Tsar, they'd hiss. Stand like a Tsar. But he was just a scared, starved little boy in a gilded cage. He was constantly supervised, his every move scrutinized, but paradoxically, also deeply neglected when it came to genuine care and affection. His mind, oh, his mind became the true battleground. It was filled not with stories and laughter, but with endless treatises on war, diplomacy, and the divine right to rule. He was forced to play roles, to pretend, to control every word that left his lips. He was taught that trust was a fatal weakness, that fear was the ultimate weapon. Imagine a child, still forming their understanding of the world, being fed a steady diet of paranoia and suspicion. The simple truth. He was taught to lie, to manipulate, to suppress every ounce of his true self. This was a psychological battlefield where his spirit was constantly under siege. And here's where it gets truly unsettling, hinting at the monster to come. There are chilling accounts from his childhood, long before he wielded absolute power, that reveal the nascent cruelty taking root. Young Ivan, reportedly, would amuse himself by throwing animals, dogs, cats from high walls, watching them fall to their deaths. Or he would ride through market squares, trampling people underfoot, only for the boyars to merely chuckle and egg him on. They saw it as childish antics, perhaps a sign of a strong will. But what we see, looking back, is a soul already twisted, a capacity for cruelty being nurtured and unchecked. This wasn't just a sign of playful mischief. It was the horrifying rehearsal for a future reign of terror. The culture clash was insane. His tutors, grizzled old men, shoved ancient, often brutal, texts down his throat. His playmates were political alliances, not friends. His toys were decrees that sent men to their deaths. He was surrounded by traditions that felt alien, by ceremonies that felt farcical, all while living in constant fear of assassination or betrayal. He lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, sleeping with a light on, waking up terrified. The emotions, a constant, sickening loop, disgust for the hypocrisy around him. Endurance, a sheer refusal to break completely. A profound sense of disorientation, utterly lost within his own skin. And slowly, horrifyingly, he was becoming a mere figurehead, a doll, a royal puppet, learning that the only way to survive was to become as ruthless, as cold, as the very people who tormented him. He screamed, he begged, he bled, but only inside, where no one could hear him, where no one cared. You might think this is an extreme case, unique to a brutal medieval court, but isn't this a chilling mirror to how we sometimes mold our own children? Pushing them into roles they don't want, forcing them to suppress their true feelings, all for the sake of success or fitting in. The scale is vastly different, yes, but the psychological blueprint, the slow erosion of a child's true self under immense pressure, is eerily, terrifyingly similar. And as this tormented child finally came of age, shedding the last vestiges of his boyhood, the world was about to discover what kind of man had been forged in this crucible of fear and cruelty. The climax of his transformation and Russia's nightmare was about to begin. If you thought you'd seen the worst, think again. The tormented child was now a terrifying man, and his breaking point, well, it was Russia's breaking point too. The moment he officially crowned himself Tsar of all Russia in 1547, at the tender age of 16, wasn't a triumph. Oh no, it was the ignition of a fuse. The boy who was once a puppet, a victim, now had the absolute power he craved, a twisted form of control born from years of utter helplessness. And what followed was not stability, but an escalating descent into unhinged tyranny. His paranoia, nurtured in the dark corners of his childhood, now blossomed into full-blown psychosis. He became utterly convinced of widespread betrayal among the boyars, the very people who had once abused him. And his response, it was brutally, sickeningly creative. He created the Oprichnina, a personal army, a terrifying force of black-clad enforcers who rode horses adorned with dog heads and brooms, symbolizing their resolve to sniff out and sweep away traitors. They weren't just soldiers, they were instruments of his unbridled terror, loyal only to him, answerable to no one. This was his twisted sense of justice, a macabre echo of the helplessness he felt as a child. The Oprichnina unleashed a reign of terror unlike anything Russia had ever seen. They raided towns, executed thousands, often with grotesque public displays. Imagine, entire families dragged from their homes, tortured, dismembered, just because Ivan suspected disloyalty. He even forced Novgorod, a thriving city, into a brutal massacre, slaughtering its inhabitants for weeks on end. These weren't just random acts. These were meticulously planned, almost ritualistic displays of power, designed to instill absolute fear and obedience. He wasn't just killing enemies. He was asserting a control he never had as a child. And the ultimate, gut-wrenching climax of his personal torment. It wasn't some grand battle or political maneuver. It was deeply, horrifically personal. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, fueled by his paranoia and perhaps decades of unaddressed trauma, he struck his own son, Ivan Ivanovich, his beloved heir, with a scepter. A blow to the head. His son, his future, the closest thing he had to genuine affection, dead. Just like that. The monster had finally devoured what little humanity remained, even his own flesh and blood. This single act of patricide is perhaps the most shocking testament to how utterly broken he had become. The culture around him, once whispering in fear, now reacted with outright horror and numb resignation. The courtiers, who had once bowed low, now exchanged glances filled with a chilling mixture of terror and despair. The common folk, who once cheered his name, now murmured about the Tsar's madness, a darkness that had consumed the very heart of Russia. Even his own guards, they looked at him not with loyalty, but with a chilling, silent question. What fresh hell would he unleash next? He stood there, hollowed out, shattered, yet perversely triumphant in his absolute power. The crown felt like a lead weight, crushing him. I can't take this anymore, he probably thought, if he could even still string coherent thoughts together. But his solution wasn't to retreat. No. It was to make everyone else suffer just as he had. This isn't life, he seemed to declare with every act of cruelty. This is a living death, and you will all join me. And with this final, terrible act of self-destruction and destruction of those he loved, Ivan began his descent into the final, agonizing chapter of his reign, a slow, terrifying unraveling that would leave a permanent scar on the soul of Russia. He had reached the terrifying peak of his power, a crown forged in blood and madness. But what happens when there's nothing left to conquer, except yourself? After the unfathomable act of murdering his own son, the Tsar's descent accelerated into a chilling, agonizing unraveling. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow, horrifying decay of mind and spirit. His paranoia, once a tool of control, now consumed him entirely. He plunged deeper into extreme piety, alternating between fits of intense prayer and horrific, bloody outbursts. He sought solace in monastic life, only to drag unwilling monks into his court and force them into grotesque parodies of religious rituals. His religious devotion became just another twisted expression of his absolute control, a desperate attempt to reconcile with a God he believed had abandoned him, or perhaps a God he thought he could command. The destruction wasn't just external anymore, it devoured his inner world. He began to see traitors everywhere, even in his closest advisors, his family, and eventually in his own reflection. He systematically alienated anyone who might have offered genuine companionship or counsel. He lived in a state of perpetual fear, fueled by hallucinations and constant suspicion, a torment far worse than any physical pain. The Grand Palace, once a symbol of his power, became his gilded cage, a monument to his terrifying isolation. He lost wives, one after another, some by his own hand, others to the brutal realities of a court riddled with his own paranoia. His personal life became a string of tragedies, each one deepening the void within him. In a twisted, almost poetic sense, Ivan was trying to free himself, to escape the boyars who tormented him, to escape the fear that gnawed at his soul. But his freedom only led to a more profound imprisonment within his own shattered mind. He had conquered his enemies, but lost the war within himself. He wanted control, but became a slave to his own terrors. If I cannot live as myself, he might have mused in those dark, sleepless nights, staring out at the kingdom he never truly wanted, then at least I will die as myself. My way, but the self he was clinging to was no longer the innocent boy. It was a distorted, monstrous echo, shaped by trauma and absolute power. His way was a path of self-destruction that dragged an entire nation along with him. He smiled, but only because he was told to, or perhaps because a twisted thought had just occurred to him. They called it ruling. He called it survival, a survival at the cost of everyone else. And as the final, poisoned chapters of Ivan's life drew to a close, leaving behind a kingdom ravaged and a lineage broken, his story would not end with his last breath. Instead, it would morph into a chilling, timeless question, echoing through the centuries to us, right here, right now. So Ivan the Terrible is dead, but his story, it's not just a historical footnote. It's a chilling, screaming warning that echoes across centuries, directly into our lives, right here, right now. To the history books, he's simply Ivan IV the Terrible, a tyrant, a madman who ruled with an iron fist and a soul soaked in blood. But is that really the whole story? Or is there something far more unsettling lurking beneath the surface of this ancient horror? Think about it. We saw a boy barely clinging to life in a viper's nest of ambition and betrayal. A child, stripped of innocence, forced to witness unspeakable acts, taught that trust was a weakness and cruelty was the only currency of survival. He wasn't born a monster, he was forged into one, hammered and twisted by the very system that crowned him. His madness wasn't some random quirk of fate. It was the chilling, predictable outcome of profound childhood trauma and absolute, unchecked power. So, who was truly the terrible? The broken boy who became a tyrant, or the world that broke him? This isn't just some dusty old history lesson, my friend. This story, it echoes into our present. We still see it, don't we? The subtle way's power can warp even the brightest minds. The quiet devastation of childhood trauma that, left unaddressed, can manifest as control, manipulation, or even outright cruelty in adulthood. Think about those mini-Ivans in our own lives, perhaps. The boss who micromanages because they're terrified of losing control. The friend who lashes out because they've never learned to process their own pain. They might not have an army, but their power can still leave a trail of emotional destruction. Ivan the Terrible wasn't just a historical figure. He was a stark, screaming warning. A terrifying reminder that the greatest disease isn't always in the body. Sometimes it's in the soul, festering from unhealed wounds, amplified by unchecked authority. It challenges us to ask, what happens when we, as a society, fail to see the signs of a tormented mind? What happens when we give absolute power without absolute accountability? Who, then, is truly perverted? The one who changes? Or the society that refuses to allow for difference, that crushes every whisper of vulnerability, and in doing so, creates the very monsters it fears? What do you think? Is Ivan the Terrible a product of his time, or a timeless lesson on the dangers of unchecked power and unhealed trauma? Drop your thoughts in the comments below right now. And if this deep dive into history's darkest corners has gripped your soul, hit that like button. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear this story, and subscribe for more mind-bending tales from the past. You won't want to miss what we uncover next.